G'day friends, welcome back to Voice in the Wilderness Australia. I'm Brian and I'm your host, and today I want to talk to you about something that is really heavy in our society, but it's also urgent that this information gets out, and that's what I'm here for. Now, Australia has the voluntary assisted dying laws, which were sold to many as a narrow, compassionate option for people with terminal illness. Now, the very real possibility is that those laws can widen like they have in Canada, Belgium, the Netherlands, places like that. Now, over time, to include people with mental illness and disabilities. Now, that expansion would not just be a legal technicality, it could change how we, as a society, value life, especially the lives of those most vulnerable in our society. Now, we'll start with just a few facts about this, and then we'll look at the risks involved. We'll look at what's happening a little bit into other countries that have accepted voluntary assisted dying, or in Canada, I think it's medical assisted in dying, MAID, M-A-I-D. And then we'll look at what Christians and what communities should do to protect the weak in our society. And by the weak, I mean people like the homeless, the elderly, the disabled, children with learning difficulties and things like that. And even elderly who have got a substantial nest egg there that kids want to get hold of. They want the inheritance now instead of later. So I'll give you a bit of a short background on the VAD laws in Australia, because that's where I am. Okay, so the voluntary assisted dying laws have been introduced in Australia. It's now legal in every Australian state and in the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory. Now, with laws that are broadly similar but not identical between all the states. Each law currently restricts access to people who meet strict eligibility criteria, typically an advanced incurable disease expected to cause death within a specified time frame. That's the criteria that it's supposed to meet. Now, also a demonstrable capacity to make the decision. That person has to be able to make that decision themselves, not be forced into it, and not have other family members or anything like that make the decision. They need to have multiple medical assessments and reporting requirements from psychologists and people like that. But importantly, people are not eligible for voluntary assisted dying on the basis of having a disability or a mental illness alone yet. A person with disability or mental illness might be eligible only if they also have a terminal medical condition that meets the law's criteria. Now, okay, so many people say, well, why does this matter? There's people are free to do what they want. We've got the laws in now, but there is a legal drift with this, and there's, as we see around the world, there's a real world expansion to these laws, because these laws don't always stay as narrow as they start, especially when politicians are involved. Politicians and activists, doctors. Across the Western world, we've seen many legal frameworks that began as simple expectations gradually broaden, sometimes by direct amendment of the law, sometimes by court interpretation, and sometimes by medical practice changing in the absence of any political pushback. In the Netherlands, for example, and Belgium, which I mentioned earlier, initially narrow euthanasia regimes have later been used in cases involving severe psychiatric suffering and dementia. Now, that's generated heated debate in those countries and around the world. Now, those experiences matter because they show how social attitudes, and we seem to all be living on social norms, social constructs and social attitudes these days. Well, some of us do. Clinical practice and the legal interpretation can all combine to broaden the access to these VAD laws. While Australia's laws currently exclude the mental illness or disability as the sole grounds for VAD, there is both political pressure and medical advocacy activity around widening that access, and that's what we need to watch closely as a community, as a society, because of all these activists with these social issues and social agendas are trying to force us into other things. So what would the expansion look like here in Australia? We need to watch for a few signals. One is legislative amendments, bills that introduce to relax eligibility criteria or to allow access where the primary condition is changed to psychiatric. That's a slippery slope. There've already been amendment bills and reviews in several jurisdictions about other aspects of the VAD laws, access in aged care, for instance, which shows the political road is open for further change. And so as an example for that, here in Queensland, the previous Labor government, we've now got an LNP government, but the previous Labor government who introduced these VAD laws were actually sending people from Queensland Health out to aged care facilities to solicit people for the VAD laws. They told them they don't have to tell their family what they're planning. They only need to tell these two doctors who were likely advocates of the VAD and worked for the government. And the government's main object of this is to cut down the costs of aged care, of healthcare, mental health. Well, they don't pay a lot out for mental health care now in the public hospital systems, but it all comes down to costs for government. So these VAD laws are not about dignity, not about compassion, they're about costing. Now, the regulatory changes and guidelines, if clinical guidance starts to treat chronic mental illness or severe disability as conditions that can meet the eligibility criteria for VAD, practice can shift before the law does. We saw that with the transgender clinics. Before anything came into law, they were giving kids puberty blockers and things like that. That's where the shift will come before the law does, or the definition of the law does. And that's why clinical guidelines and health department policies really matter, and it matters that they are followed sort of to the T. Now, we see court cases and capacity tests and legal challenges that reinterpret capacity or suffering in ways that broaden who qualifies. A judge shouldn't be left to overturn something like that due to just hearing the little bit of evidence there and then. The whole picture needs to be looked at, and we need more public advocacy. We need campaigns by rights groups or activist clinicians framing access for psychiatric suffering as a matter of equality and non-discrimination. It's got nothing to do with non-equality or discrimination. It's got to do with taking someone's life, and taking that life at the hands of another person is what is usually a case with these VAD laws. Now, any of the paths that we discuss, or even a combination of them, could result in people being eligible for assisted dying for reasons that are far beyond the terminal cancer or end-stage diseases that many assumed that the laws were about, and that's what they agreed to. That's what they said, yes, I don't mind having the VAD laws. But you know politicians, you know activists, they will push it further. Now, let me just be plain and simple with you. Expanding voluntary assisted dying to include people whose primary suffering is mental illness and disability, it carries a real specific danger. Firstly, the question of capacity. Mental illness can affect judgment, hope, and perception of burdens. Determining beyond reasonable doubt that someone has the capacity to make a decision to end their life is intensely difficult when depression or psychosis or cognitive impairment are involved. Even with safeguards, assessments are not foolproof. Even with those safeguards, that people can fool the assessments, people can appear, especially mentally ill people. I deal with them on a day-to-day basis out in the streets. They can appear totally cognitive, totally straight down the line. And then they can just sometimes just click, and there you get it, what the true nature is. Now, we need to also look at social pressure and structural neglect. Now, the risk isn't always a direct push to kill. It can be a quieter pressure. When society says there is an option, when healthcare and social supports are inadequate, vulnerable people, and there are many of them, may feel that they are a burden. Their families of the aged may make their elderly parents or aunts or uncles feel like they are a burden. Oh, we can't continue to keep paying for this respite home. We can't afford to keep looking after you. That's forming a burden on that person. Now, when carers, hospitals or families struggle to provide long-term support, the existence of VAD can subtly, or even in cases not so subtly, become an expectation rather than a last resort. And that's what I mean by making people think that they're a burden. Thirdly, discrimination against the disabled. When disability or chronic mental health conditions are treated as morally acceptable reasons for assisted death, that sends a message, intentional or not, about the worth of a disabled life. Disabled people, that's where equality comes in. Disabled people deserve to live as much as you and me. They don't often, they might have periods where they feel like, oh, I want to die. But with right care, right attitudes, that can actually change. Now, these aren't abstract concerns. They're not just my concerns, they're concerns of many. They're why disability advocates, medical ethicists, and parts of the medical profession have urged caution or resisted expansion. They're also why some countries, notably Canada in this case, have paused or delayed widening access to mental health only eligibility until systems and safeguards are improved. But Canada will allow it. Canada is a very left-run state, and it will allow, I think it's in 2027, they're going to allow psychiatric problems as a sole acceptance for their VAD or MAID laws. Proponents make stronger emotional arguments about this. They say, why deny compassionate relief to someone in unbearable, treatment-resistant suffering? They argue equality. If we allow terminal patients to choose, why exclude other sufferers? Now, let's make one thing totally clear here. There are some fantastic palliative care treatments out there and people who administer those treatments. You don't need to choose death if you're in pain. I'm in pain every single day after my accident in the army, but I live with that. I live with God, because until God came into my life, I was like these people. But enough of that. And those are not trivial points. But the counter argument is also powerful. Compassion that ends life risks becoming a cheap substitute for real compassion that heals, that treats, that supports and protects. And that's what we should be doing for our vulnerable in society. We must ask, are we addressing suffering, or are we making death the solution because living is too expensive, too hard, or too inconvenient, often for those people who are not the ones with the illness? Now, as Christians, because as you know, I'm a Christian, you don't have to understand this from a Christian perspective, though, if you're not. But as Christians, our starting place is this. Human life has intrinsic worth because each person is made in the image of God. That value doesn't come from our health, our utility, productivity, or independence. That has practical consequences for policy. We must oppose any law that treats disability or mental illness as a lesser life. They're not. It's not a lesser life to have a disability or a mental illness. You can still live life to the absolute fullest of your capacity. Our faith calls on us to protect the weak not remove them from society, not remove them from our sight, to care for them. Now, we must prefer systems that expand palliative care, and as I said, palliative care is growing in leaps and bounds. If someone asks for death, we should ask, did we do everything to relieve their suffering? Did we try every reasonable therapy? Did we support the family, the carers, the finances? Because it always comes back to the finances, and these VAD laws are approved because of the government's finances. And we must be aware of false compassion. Ending a life might look merciful in that moment, but is it mercy if it's chosen because society hasn't offered you any alternative? Now, this is not about forcing people to suffer. It's about insisting on a robust, life-affirming response to their suffering. Now, if you want plain evidence where jurisdictions have broadened criteria, for example, permitting psychiatric cases, I mentioned it briefly before, the number of non-terminal euthanasia requests and approvals have risen. Now, that's prompted significant debate in Europe and cautionary responses in countries like Canada. They say the government says it's introduced or prompted cautionary studies in Canada, but when you look at the studies, their MAID numbers from 2016, I think it is, have pretty much doubled every year, and I think it's up to about 10 or 20,000 now, or in 2023 it was, and they think it's going to be up to 200 to 500,000 people will choose this because their social economic standard of living isn't the best. So in the future they will choose to die instead of be poor. Okay, so we need to be vigilant. In Australia, the current legal wording generally excludes mental illness or disability as a sole ground. The legislative amendments and policy changes are already being discussed in several states. And we will see the Australian Labor Party and the state Labor parties pushing for those, because the Labor Party is now all about killing people, killing the vulnerable, which is the elderly, the disabled, the unborn child. They love that. It's part of their ethos now, not the working man, but killing the vulnerable. And legislative amendments and policy changes are already being discussed, as I said, in several states. For example, debates about aged care exemptions and facility obligations show the law is not static. That's why vigilance matters, my friends. We must be vigilant in this to make sure our elderly and our disabled and our children are protected. So what can you do about it as a citizen, as a Christian, as someone who cares about justice but might be an atheist? What do we do about this? We stay informed about our state's VAD laws and any proposed amendments. Now, laws differ state by state. Be ready to read and respond when the legislative changes or the bills appear as public notices from your parliament in your state or territory. And go out and be an advocate and support better palliative care and mental health care services. Our governments need to put more money into mental health care. As I said, I work on the streets with homeless people and families that are doing it tough. And people are having mental health episodes. They go to the local hospital, they get given drugs, which once they're out of hospital, they're not going to take anyway, and then they get discharged back onto the streets straight away. That's not care. That's just causing the system to spend less money, and that's what the governments are about. I don't care whether it's LNP, Labor, Greens, whatever. It's all about the cost factor. Now, contact your local MP and ask for real funding for home-based palliative care, suicide prevention and disability supports, because there is the stuff out there. You just need to be able to access it. And we have the NDIS now, but there are so many NDIS contributors or agencies that are rorting the system. I hear about it every week. I hear of something else that's happened to rort the NDIS system. Now, also go out, listen and advocate with compassion. If someone in your church or your family or just someone around you, your workplace is struggling, don't send them away with platitudes. Help them to find counselling, community services and medical help, because that is you helping your community, helping your friends, your family. And that's what we need to do. We need to get together and not burden or make our friends and family to be burdens, but to help them. And go out and engage in public consultation. When governments call for submissions or reviews, don't be lax, don't be lazy. Make a submission. These processes matter. It's our democratic right. It's our process. So make a submission and get your point across. And support organisations that defend the dignity of disabled people. Their voices are crucial because they speak from lived experience. Like there's people out there who have been homeless for years, but now they're in accommodation, they're in jobs, and they feel worthy again. They realise that if they had have gone for something like these VAD laws back when they were homeless, they realise how much they would have lost out on. Now, at its core, let's make this a moral test for Australia. Do we create a system that offers life, dignity and care to those who suffer? Or do we create a system that makes death an administration option when life becomes costly or inconvenient or painful? If you really care about being a civilised, compassionate society, and if you follow Jesus, or even if you don't, then the choice is clear. We should value life. We should demand better care from those who we elect to make the laws. And we need to protect the vulnerable from policies from those evil politicians, policies that cheapen life. Okay, I don't want to make this video too long, but if you've been moved in any way by this, I'm doing another video soon about a business on the Gold Coast that was selling death, selling suicide for profitable gain, and they were getting away with it for so long. Now, if things like that move you, please like this video, share it to far and wide. I don't use social media, I only use YouTube. So if you want to share this video or this podcast, please do. And subscribe to Voice in the Wilderness Australia, or Voice in the Wilderness on Spotify. Down in the description, I've pinned links to the VAD laws and recent reviews, so you can read it for yourself. If you're in Australia, check your state health site and consider contacting your local MP about funding palliative care and mental health supports, because they're sorely needed. We see that there are so many mental illness out there these days. And finally, my friends, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Leave a comment. What would you want your church to do if a member, or even if someone off the street came in and asked about voluntary assisted dying by saying life's too much for them anymore? I read every comment and I'm keen to hear your perspective, because it's your perspective on these things that matter. It doesn't matter. These are my opinions based on facts that I've got at hand. But what really matters is your perspective of these things. So thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian. This is Voice in the Wilderness. And please, my friends, stand strong, love well, and keep speaking for those vulnerable ones in our society. Till next time, bless you.